I easily could have taken a second to Google this, but I didn't. There was some movie that came out a few years ago as a kid's movie. It was computer animated, and it had a bunch of characters from folklore like the Tooth Fairy and Santa Claus and the Easter Bunny. And they're all together, and if I remember right, they got stronger and weaker based on how much people believed in their respective thing. And if I'm butchering this movie, which clearly did not make much of an impression on me, you can just point to any number of movies about Santa Claus and Christmas. It's always like, oh, the belief-o-meter is tanking out, kids. We've got to get people fired up and in the Christmas spirit, or I'm going to turn into dust and float away in front of your faces and emotionally scar you forever. And then they go around, Christmas spirit gets up, parents get undivorced, and everything's fine in the end. But the key there is this concept that these fairy tale characters can't continue to exist without your ongoing belief. I've told you this before. That's the plot of Neil Gaiman's book, American Gods. And this very much is the question we've had in view for the last couple of conversations here in Matthew chapter 17, because of some stuff that Jesus says that is reminiscent of some stuff that he said earlier in the book about miracles being tied maybe to human belief or human behavior. And so we've been wrestling with that question of, can there be miracles when you believe, or are miracles just a thing that God does because he wants to do them? I've teased it for 2 days, and today we're actually doing it. Here's what's happened so far in Matthew chapter 17. The very end of chapter 16, I guess, Jesus tells the disciples that some of y'all are standing here, and you're not going to taste death before you see the Son of Man coming in his kingdom. Very next thing. Jesus and 3 of the disciples, James, John, and Peter, go up on this mountain. We're not quite sure which one, but I think it's probably Mount Hermon way up north. And they go up on the mountain, and there Jesus is transformed or transfigured before their eyes, and he shines bright like the sun. And then Moses and Elijah show up. It's like, whoa, you are not the abolition of the law and the prophets, but the completion, the fulfillment of the law and the prophets. Just like you said in Matthew 5:17, Peter wants to build some huts for reasons we've explored, and God is like, hey, enough with the huts. That part is a paraphrase. What he definitely says is, this is my son whom I love. With him I'm well pleased. Listen to him. And then everything goes away, and the disciples poke their heads back up, and Jesus is just there, and they walk down the mountain. They talk about what's going on. And Elijah and John the Baptist, they come off the mountain after this otherworldly encounter, and they're met with a very this worldly request from a dude who has every reason to ask. He believes that Jesus can do something about his son's seizures. This man accredits these seizures to some kind of physical phenomenon. Jesus answers him by indicating that it is indeed a spiritual phenomenon manifesting in a physical way, in that Jesus performs an exorcism when all is said and done, and the boy gets better when the demon goes away. But then what happens is the guy makes the request. We've seen requests like this, bold faith requests like this elsewhere. And Jesus is like, wow, that's great. It's amazing faith. That's really cool. And he commends it, and then he does the thing, even just a couple pages earlier. This time, though, the guy specifically says, I brought my seizured kid to your disciples, but they couldn't heal him. And then Jesus turns around and he says, oh, unbelieving and perverse generation. This is verse 17 of chapter 17. How long shall I stay with you? How long shall I put up with you? Bring the boy here to me. And Jesus rebuked the demon. It came out of the boy, and he was healed from that moment. I don't think he's having some kind of emotional meltdown here that's directed at this dude or this dude's kid or the disciples. But I do think there's an expectation, an urgency here that's indicated by a lot of his words and his actions of late, that he really wants his guys to get it and be able to grab the torch from him, because he just keeps saying, I'm going to go die soon. I need you guys to be ready. So then the disciples came to Jesus in private and asked, why couldn't we drive it out? He replied, because you have so little faith. I tell you the truth, if you have faith as small as a mustard seed, you can say to this mountain, move from here to there, and it'll move. Nothing will be impossible for you. Now, the mustard seed thing probably pops off the page a little bit for you, because there's a whole parable about the mustard seed in chapter 13. That parable in verse 31 goes, he told them another parable. The kingdom of heaven is like a mustard seed, which a man took and planted in his field. And though it's the smallest of all your seeds, yet when it grows, it's the largest of garden plants, and it becomes a tree, so that the birds of the air come and perch in its branches. I think that's pretty important here, because the kingdom parables of Matthew chapter 13 are all about answering the question of how the kingdom is going to play out. What is this going to look like? How's this all going to work out? Are you just going to come and dominate everything immediately, and everybody's going to have to acknowledge right off the bat that, whoa, you were definitely God. We should have listened to you all along. Or is it going to be a mixed bag? Is there going to be a process here? And obviously Matthew chapter 13 and all of Jesus' kingdom parables teaches that it's going to be a mixed bag. And so I don't think it's an accident that Jesus references back to this mustard seed image. And the context indicates to me that this is intentional. That faith that is as small as a mustard seed, well, what is that faith? It's a kernel. It's the genetic packet that contains all the data of the values of the kingdom, the repeatable data of all of the values of the kingdom. And so again, I think we're still in this mindset of the big pressing question for Jesus is you got this little thing right now that is the presence of the Son of God, this nugget of kingdom reality that needs to duplicate out 30, 60, 100 times over and make this gigantic kingdom thing a reality. Now, Jesus, I presume, knows that it's going to work out, but narratively, in the flow of history here, it looks like he's really pushing to get his disciples ready so that this little thing that is just no bigger than a mustard seed can grow and reproduce and expand into something much bigger. And right now, at this moment on page 1491 in my Bible, it looks like we got a really long ways to go before this can happen and before everybody is ready. Why am I talking about all of this when we're trying to talk about where miracles come from and how it works? Because I think the clear and evident point of the passage is not to answer the question I am posing about miracles. I think the clear and obvious point of the passage is that Jesus is still communicating with his disciples about this evolution of the kingdom, this advancement of the kingdom that right now seems so small and fledgling and vulnerable, but that he keeps proclaiming is going to be big and gigantic. And that part of the way it's going to get big and gigantic is that he is going to go and die and be raised again. And part of the way it's going to be so big and gigantic is because of what he just said back here in chapter 16 to Peter. You're Peter, and on this rock I'm going to build my church, and the gates of Hades, of death, are not going to prevail against it. So Jesus is looking at this grand outcome that he knows is coming, that he is trying to prepare the disciples for. But the middle chunk of Matthew seems to be this series of cycles of the disciples kind of getting it a little bit more, but then it's very clear they're very, very, very not ready. And so Jesus invests more heavily in them, and they get it a little bit more, and they try to go and reintegrate into the larger world and society, but then they get bombarded with all of these outside distractions, and Jesus has to pull back with them again to work with them that much more to get them to understand what is actually going on and how this little mustard seed of the kingdom is going to grow up into this great, big, glorious kingdom tree, and how they're going to be a part of it. That said, I still think it's a valid question to ask the one we're asking. How does the miracle thing work? And I guess in order to think about this, we have to break it down into a few different groups. There are going to be people sitting in on this conversation who would hear the question, how does the miracle thing work? And their answer is going to be, it doesn't. That wasn't a thing before. That isn't a thing now. That never will be a thing. The natural order of things is how things are, and humans read into events that are on the fringes of normal, and they inflict stories on that, and the stories are very interesting, and they shape culture and history, but ultimately, there is no supernatural. There is only the natural. If something exists, it is definitionally part of the natural, they would say, and therefore, this question is a fun exercise for theists, but at this point in the podcast, the no miracles naturalist would say, I'll just sit back and let you guys have the conversation quietly and respectfully, and we'll see where it goes. So that's one position. Another position on miracles would be miracles did happen. Not that often in the Bible, but they are there from time to time, and they're not around so much anymore. Some people would call this the cessationist position, though there are also people who believe that miracles could occur today and maybe occasionally do, but they're very, very few and far between, and the evidence and data doesn't support there being tons of them just floating around all the time willy-nilly right now. And I could be accused of being in that camp-ish. I don't think miracles have gone away entirely, if miracles are indeed a thing, but I don't think they happen at nearly the rate you hear people advertising on the internet. So when we're tackling this question of what part does God play and what part do people play in the unfolding of miracles, you're going to have people who come at it and say, miracles? No, they don't exist. You're going to have other people who say miracles once and maybe not quite so frequently now. Then you're going to have people who say miracles, yes. Yes then, yes now, yes all the time. They happen a lot. Then there are going to be other people who would say, well, regardless of how often miracles happen, if they do happen at any time, that is only by the work of God. He's in charge of that. There is no miraculous partnership. It's all God. There are other people who would say, okay, well, if miracles happen and when miracles happen, maybe it kind of depends on the situation. Maybe sometimes miracles happen that are important to the center, thread, thrust of all of redemptive history, and God's going to do it with or without people, and with or without the belief of people. It doesn't matter. It's happening. Christ was going to the cross and being raised from the dead, whether everybody was into it or not. So some people would look at that and say, when miracles happen, maybe it depends. Sometimes it's inevitable and God's just going to do it. Other times, maybe it's not in that center cut of redemptive history, and God just does something beautiful and redemptive that's a surprise and breaks the laws of time and space in one instance, and then he just doesn't in the next. Okay, could be. There are other people who would say, no, it's always dependent on human faith. If people don't believe, God cannot work. It's more of that kind of American Gods, typical Santa Claus movie, or whatever the other movie is that I can't think of anyway, which is a great way to introduce a podcast, by the way. We're getting into the juicy stuff now, but I don't want to rush this and ask Jeff to cram this all down into some tight little edit where we skip a bunch of the processing that we're doing together. So this is just going to be one of those where I record the whole thing sitting right here. It's going to be a two-parter, and we'll just pick it up right where we left off tomorrow and round out this thought. I'm Matt. This is the 10-Minute Bible Hour podcast. Let's do this again soon.